Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we're going to talk about the challenge of creating infrastructure fit for the future. It remains clear that investment in new infrastructure is still a fundamental part of the so-called plan for growth. But critically, to be fit for the future and investable for the public and private sector, today's projects must also deliver social benefits in the form of reduced carbon emissions, greater social inclusion, employment and community cohesion. The new East-West Rail project between Oxford and Cambridge is one such project aiming to create a transport system fit for the future. So it's my great pleasure to welcome East-West Rail Chief Executive Beth West to the Infrastructure Podcast to discuss the challenge of modern delivery and perhaps also to give us an update on how the project is getting on. Beth, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thanks very much, Anthony. It's great to be with you today.
Great. Well, let's start by finding out a bit more about the East-West Rail project. Beth, you took over as Chief Exec almost a year ago to the day, I think, in March 2022. What have you achieved in the last 12 months?
Well, the biggest thing that we've achieved is that the certainty that we're going to go ahead. When I joined last year, it was very much of a, let's see how it's going to go. The government's not quite convinced. And the really great thing we've been able to achieve over the course of this year is to go from that position to showing up in not only in the autumn statement in November, but in this year's budget as well in March. So the government is really committed to making sure that we are here to unlock growth between Oxford and Cambridge to facilitate that golden triangle.
Big relief all round when that appears in the budget, I imagine.
I know everyone was very excited, and there were lots of jokes about eating of hats as well. That in terms of where we got into the priority list.
Well, the East-West Rail programme is designed to create this link between Oxford and Cambridge, with jobs, education opportunities, and it's key to supporting national growth and building the local economy. But you say it's more than just a railway. Why do you say that?
Well, I think it probably goes back to my fundamentals of why I've been interested in infrastructure in the first place. It's more than a railway because we want it to be integrated into the fabric of people's lives. So when we say that, it's about how do we think about it being more than just a couple of stations and some track, but rather thinking much more widely about how do people get from their homes to the stations, onto the railway, and out the other side, and how we do that thing of integrating into the community so that we are being there for what they want their stations, how they're going to travel, rather than just a big piece of infrastructure. It's
a big challenge when when you're trying to give people access to employment, and allowing people to have that confidence to invest. How does East-West Rail actually go about creating those vital links for people?
The first thing you mentioned is about confidence. And one of the things is that you can see that when there is commitment to infrastructure projects, companies start to make investment decisions off the back of that investment coming. So that's step one in terms of looking at that growth and that wider growth agenda. So what we've had with the budget is the ability, and what we'll have in May when we announce our route alignment, is the ability for investors to start knowing what's going to happen and make their own investment decisions, which will bring much more money into those regions, and that's really the first step in developing that confidence. The next thing is about then how do we talk to our communities and make sure that they are understanding how this is going to impact them, and that we are doing those connections, and we are working with the local communities to make sure that we're integrating rather than sort of doing something that's going to be separating them and pulling them apart. So it's being really curious about what local communities want and need. And I think the third thing that's really important is then thinking about the rest of the infrastructure investment that's needed in the region. So, I know that there are power shortages and water issues in Cambridge. So how do we think about all of the infrastructure investment more widely so that we can make sure that we're integrating those things and getting the best outcomes for the local communities?
Well, let's build on that and perhaps get a quick update of how you're getting on. Connection Stage 1 is going to see services run between Oxford and Bletchley and Milton Keynes. That's hoped by 2025, I think.
Yes.
And you're busy upgrading an existing section of railway between Oxford and Bicester. How are you getting on in terms of hitting that first 2025 target?
So Oxford to Bicester is running, and there are trains going on that bit now. The Bicester to Bletchley part of the railway is going well. We are laying track, and so that we are still planning to open up in 2025, and are really looking forward to that.
And of course, as you said, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt revealed in the latest March budget that the route for the final section between Bedford and Cambridge will be announced in May. I mean, why is that such a significant moment in terms of developing this rail service fit for the future?
So it's a really important moment for people, because one of the things that we do not that well actually is we leave people in limbo for too long. So by having our route announcement coming out in May, what that's able to do is be really, really clear on what our route is and how that's going to impact people directly. So what we'll be able to do then is have discussions with the people who are impacted much more, with much more certainty, so that we can take steps to sort of get people out of limbo. And if there are people whose houses need to be purchased, we can do that, and we can complete those things and help them move on to the next stage of their lives. But it also then allows us to move on to the next step, which is to develop our design and then move into our statutory consultation process that leads us to submit our development consent order. So it's a massive milestone. It's a massive, massive milestone for us.
Yeah, it means you can then develop your team accordingly. I imagine expand your team and develop your team.
Yes.
So what happens next? What are the big challenges on your desk right now? Is it about creating that team, or is it about getting that design ready? I mean, what are the challenges?
One of the things that I'm really conscious of is that we are still a pop-up client. So we are a small, we need to be by our very nature small and nimble, and we are trying to organize ourselves that way. We're also setting ourselves up to be working cross-functionally at the very outset, so that we can make sure that we iterate when it's cheap, is what I keep saying, is that there are lots of issues that we need to think about. And the best time to think about those things is at the outset, before we start doing the big work and spending the big money, because that's when we're going to minimize the risk, that we're going to be making hopefully the right decisions, and making sure that those decisions are, again, trying to meet our outcomes, and we don't forget about something. So dealing with environmental issues and sustainability issues and thinking about biodiversity net gain are all things we should be doing not right now. So we're not adding it on sometime at the outset, because that's when it often leads to scope change, rework, additional costs, and things like that. If we do it at the beginning with these cross-functional teams, I think we stand a better chance of getting the scope right in the long run. So we're in the process of developing the teams to do that, but recognizing that we also have a life cycle as a pop-up client, and we will need different people with different skills as we go through that. And so we're trying to build a team that's going to be pretty agile and nimble, and that we're not trying to set up a behemoth organization for all eternity, but rather have people in place at the right time in the right roles.
Right.
The other thing then is cracking on with this design. It's really important that we when we go for our statutory consultation next year, we have something that's robust and we can have a good conversation with our communities. And then the other thing is once we go and make our route announcement, we're going to do a lot of work with our communities. So it's again getting our teams ready to talk and have lots of cups of tea with people, so we can make sure we're building those relationships in a positive way.
Well, we'll talk a bit more about your role as a client and drinking tea in a moment. Let's talk a bit more about you for the moment, though. You're originally, as your accent gives away, you're originally from the US, studied in Washington before starting a career in finance. How did you become immersed in infrastructure?
So it actually started when I was doing my master's. So my first year I spent in Bologna, and I spent a lot of time studying the EU and how the EU and the integrated economies and the growth, the positive development of France and German economies in particular stopped them from shooting each other. Which is an inherent good thing, that France and Germany don't shoot at each other anymore.
It's a great outcome.
It's a very good outcome. And so I spent the summer after Bologna in Croatia when the war in the former Yugoslavia was going on. And when I looked at what was going on, and I realized that a lot of the reason that people were fighting is that essentially people had devolved down into tribes and were fighting over power and stuff. And so when combining why are people shooting each other with how do we stop people from shooting each other, led me to want to be involved in economic development. And I wanted to be involved in economic development without imposing any cultural values. And infrastructure is an amazing way to help economies develop, because everybody needs infrastructure. There are no cultural values coming along with wanting to have roads and clean water and telecommunications and power. That is stuff that is good and that every economy needs to have. And so that's how I got involved in project finance, which was the banking work that I did, is that, it was a private sector way to finance infrastructure. And it sort of led to I started working in power and oil and gas and a bit of telecoms, and then moved across to transport when I joined Transport for London after I moved to London.
Okay, now so you've been chief exec at East West Rail since for the last year now. Before that, you were at contractor Balfour Beatty, and then developer Landsec. And you were commercial director during the early days of HS2, I think, where you formed the procurement strategy. And of course, as you say, you also spent nearly 9 years, I think, at Transport for London, driving their commercial strategy. I mean, what attracted you to this particular rail project, to jump back into the client side and get stuck into another rail project?
Well, I think it's all the bones of all the stuff I care about, really. It's about trying to deliver a railway differently, but also about what is infrastructure here to do. And I think that East West Rail...
Right, so it's that beyond the railway thing.
Absolutely. And having worked on the property development side as well, it was really an ability to think about sort of the railway and how transformational infrastructure really impacts development, and how do we stitch these things together. And that was a really exciting bit about it, is the opportunity to stitch the railway into wider development.
I mean, you talk about being a pop-up client. I mean, you've worked on the client side.
Yes.
I mean, what have you learned about being a good client?
Well, I think being a good client is knowing what you're doing, what you're not doing in the first instance, is, how broad is your remit, and understanding that. And then I think that for me, it's always been about listening, because we can't deliver anything without our supply chain, and having good relationships with our supply chain is going to be really, really important, as well as good relationships with the wider rail ecosystem. But to be that good client, you have to be making sure your organization as well is going to match your procurement strategy. And I think that that's one of the biggest things I've learned, is that those things have to absolutely marry up. I always say you can do anything, you can have any structure you want, but as long as both sides match and everybody is committed to those both sides, that's where you're going to find success. If you've got a mismatch, that's when it starts to become problematic.
And it's fascinating that you talk about the role of infrastructure to bring communities together, but of course, infrastructure, it is a common denominator, but it's also hugely political. I imagine that the number of local authorities you have, a number of cities, local enterprise partnerships. East West Rail touches huge numbers of political environments there. You must spend a great deal of time managing politics. I mean, how do you approach this? What are your time spending? I know you worked in the US House of Representatives. What did that teach you about politicians and dealing with politicians?
Well, I think the biggest thing is infrastructure should absolutely be non-political. But it can be political. But what you want to do, and I think that the key thing is that if you've got a bipartisan, or in other countries where you've got more coalition governments, what you want to have is bipartisan support for what you're doing. If you have a project that is so political that an election cycle is going to kill it, if the governing party changes, you do really have a problem, because infrastructure projects tend to last longer than any one parliament, any one Congress in the US. So you have a lot of things that we have to do is building that support across the political spectrum. And what's really interesting from an East West Rail perspective is all of our local authorities are completely across the political spectrum. So, that's that bit of great news for us, is that we've got support from the local authorities that cover all the parties, which is really, really great, because I think it's important that we've got that support, and it's a grassroots support, we've got the national support, but also the grassroots support across the political spectrum. But, obviously we have to keep having those conversations and keep, I keep talking about filling the bank of goodwill. And, it's not we get the sign off and that's fine. We have to keep having conversations and demonstrating that this is going to be value for money, and a thing that making sure that it's what communities want.
Many cups of tea. You're drinking tea with many politicians.
Many cups of tea.
Well, of course, it was International Women's Day last month. What has been your secret to success? Do you consider yourself to be a role model?
I mean, I think that I have to consider myself a role model, and I'm mindful of that, as well as I think people who are in the public eye should be mindful of the fact that what they do and say will have an impact. I sometimes joke that I think I might have succeeded despite myself rather than and because I think also with my accent and being a woman in this environment, I feel like my head's always above the parapet, and so I want my head above the parapet for the right reasons and in a really, really positive way, so that I'm able to demonstrate that I'm adding value and that I am, making sure that I'm working hard and I'm able to, make things happen. So I've been just very conscious that my visibility makes me, I need to be doing what I can to be really positive and being a role model to other people.
So how do you let off steam when you're not busy working at East West Rail?
There's a lot of time I spend with my family and driving my children around to various sporting activities, which I'm not sure is quite letting off steam. But I try to see
very
friends
necessary.
And do exercise, and very necessary. And I think that what's been great over the past few years, because my boys are now 14 and 12, and we've got really stuck in with our local sports club, and it's taught me a load of lessons as well about leadership, actually, because setting a tone for how people behave will have really positive impacts. And my younger son's cricket, team, we have, what's happened is that we have a load of parents who started to volunteer, and then now that's just what everybody does. We have probably the best, most, sort of active group of parents across the club, because that's just what's happened. And the boys are absolutely delightful. So there's a whole leadership thing that I've learned from watching these now 12-year-olds behave and their parents, about how we set a tone, and it's been really, really fantastic. But it's a great place to just hang out with a bunch of people in the same state of life, and for us to let off steam as well.
What's interesting, it was something which Richard Robinson mentioned about in one of the previous podcasts around the way that supporting people from the sideline it's a very interesting and important thing, but do it in the right way. So
absolutely, and it is about the shadow that you cast, and what are the messages you're sending, actively or subconsciously, and how does that play into how everybody else behaves? It's really interesting to just observe it from that perspective as well.
Okay, well, we're talking today about creating infrastructure fit for the future. How would you describe what you are doing that's different at East West Rail to make sure that you are fit for the future?
One of the really big things is this whole working cross-functionally in project teams. We're trying to make sure that we are lean as possible, not so brutal that we're burning people out, but rather that we're making sure that we are doing what we need to do to get to our outcomes. The other thing is that, in terms of trying to get that right, we will sometimes fail, and that's okay. And we need to make sure that when we do fail, that we reward people for trying, because if you don't try, you're not going to be able to do things that are different. But that we're also in a space that we're able to so repair anything that's gone wrong. So and I think it's again trying to get into a culture where people feel confident trying new things, because what we put around them is the support that if they do fail, that they feel still loved, and they get a bit of a cuddle rather than getting shouted at,
right, yeah.
And that we can obviously do that quickly. So one of our behaviors is to learn quickly, so that we don't sort of keep repeating something that has gone wrong.
One of the things which that is very important, I suppose, in this project is, and you describe it as being socially inclusive. I mean, how do you, and you talk also about having lots of cups of tea, but how do you ensure that you get the views and the voices from everybody in that society, rather than just the ones that shout loud?
It's a really, really good question, because I think what happens often is that what people do is they talk to organized groups, and organized groups tend to be self-selecting, and they represent a viewpoint. And the big thing is then, how do you go beyond the organized groups and make sure that you're talking to a wider community? So that is going to be trying to find ways to make sure we're inviting people to events, and that we're able to communicate that more widely and find different ways, because now we've got 14 different ways that we can actually disseminate information rather than just an advert in the local newspaper. So we have to make sure that we are finding all the ways that people are engaging, and having those multimodal approaches for how we engage, so that we can get beyond just those self-selecting organized groups. Which is a bit more effort. It's we have to try harder to make sure we're tapping into those groups.
That's knocking on doors. It's knocking on doors as well as just sending emails.
Yes, and it's working with our local authority, partners to say, well, how does your community organize? It's not ignoring what exists in the communities, but trying to go along with it. To make sure that we're tapping into all the knowledge that we've got more widely.
Let's talk a little bit about, I suppose, what people actually are wanting and doing in their lives now, because, of course, investing in rail is expensive, but of course, COVID has also changed the way that we work, and working from home. Hybrid working patterns are now the norm. I mean, do you think that that's having an impact on the kind of services that you're looking to provide?
I mean, I think it does. It can't not. But I think this goes into how do we make it really easy for people to travel. I have a strop about ticketing generally, because on the national network. So if you're an infrequent traveler and it's too difficult to buy a ticket, are you going to get on a train? I don't think you are. And so it's sort of how do we, for me, it's a big question about our design and how are we designed for the customer, and thinking about that in, now, and what do we think the future customers are going to look like? Because we have to make it super easy for people to want to get on the train. And I can't come back to this enough. If we want people to have, bums on seats on trains, we have to make it easy.
Which means when you're designing your digital strategy, right now, it is not just about making sure that you're embracing digital technology in the design and the construction. It's about the operation. It's about how people interact with your railway in the future.
Absolutely, and I think that's probably the most important thing. And we start with operations and maintenance and asset management, and we work our way back then to what does that mean for construction? Because if we're not thinking about the end, what the end is going to look like, we're probably not going to get the construction right and what we're going to build. So it's that whole thing about, we don't need to know everything right now, but we certainly have to have an idea. And it's knowing how all those different systems are going to interface with each other is really, really important, because, as railways are all about interfaces, and so knowing how all those interfaces work is very important. But we have to be designing this so that operations and maintenance actually, talk to each other, and that we're, if there is something that goes wrong, we have the least impact on our customers as possible.
Which is an important thing, just to finish off with your advice, because I suppose infrastructure professionals, they can get bogged down in simply building things as opposed to actually having an eye on what they're actually trying to get as an outcome. What's your advice to young infrastructure professionals, desperate to ensure that their projects really work for people?
I mean, I think that anybody who wants to go into infrastructure has to look at, why are you doing it? Why do you want to build? Why is any piece of infrastructure going to be built? What is the reason behind it? So, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? And then what are your potential solutions to that? So I think that, if young people want to be involved in infrastructure, they do need to really understand who is going to be using it and why is anything going to get built? And I think in terms of getting ideas across to me and people like me, I have a very open door. I'm very interested in having conversations. We're talking about having a hackathon with our supply chain later this year, and sort of not normal supply chain engagement, but how do we actually bring ideas to the mix? And I expect that we'll be doing lots of those kinds of events in future.
Beth, that sounds like a great idea. If everyone's got some ideas about how to make the rail project even better, then just get hold of you, fire those ideas into you, and let's see what happens. Beth, thanks so much for joining me today on the Infrastructure Podcast. That's all we've got time for, but it's been great to chat to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
As I say, that's all we've got time for today on the Infrastructure Podcast, but we have many more guests to talk to as we continue to probe the big issues that are faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the new Infrastructure Podcast website. That's www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share with your friends and colleagues. So thanks very much for joining us again today. Thanks to Beth, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.